All right, so this session is agreements, work plans, budgets, and subawards, all of those topics. And we have, for today, we have Scott Frump from Michigan State University. He's the Finance and Administrative Officer for the Food Security Group within the Department of Agricultural, Food, and Resource Economics at Michigan State University. Food Security Group's current portfolio contains 35 international awards. And I know I've worked personally with Scott on lots of things, and he knows these things in and out. We also have Dr. Corey O'Hara from IDE Nepal. He's in the IDE Nepal Country Director, and he specializes in ethical sourcing and value creation for smallholders. He earned a PhD in nutrition from Tufts University and holds dual master's degrees in agricultural and environmental science and policy. Previously, he worked at the US State Department and as an associate director of the Clinton Global Initiative, where he also founded and coordinated the Haiti Action Network. So welcome, and here is the first slide. Thank you.
Well, excuse me. Well, good morning, everyone. I think this is, in a funny way, it's the largest topic area of all of the sessions. There's a lot that can be wrapped up in all three of these topics: work planning, budgeting, and contracting. And it can also be really, really dry. So I think we sought to give everyone points of reference on these slides. There's a lot of information. But I think we probably should just be talking through it in a more casual way. So instead of going through all of these slides, I think Scott and I are just going to talk about our own experiences and let the participants use these slides as a resource after the session to go through in more detail. I think there's, in a way, also what we're talking about now often comes before that kickoff meeting. The work planning process, at least for IDE, very often starts during the initial budgeting phase as the project is being designed during that application process. So at least for us, we want to know exactly what we're going to be doing to the extent possible ahead of time. That helps us to plan for budgets, helps us to plan for staffing appropriately. And here there's a 5-step process around work planning, but what we're really talking about is just figuring out what you're going to do to be able to reach your goals and objectives. I think this the concept under step 2, where it says following SMART principles, that's a really important one. SMART means specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. So in other words, thinking about specific would be the who, what, and how much. Measurable means something you can actually track with numbers, or I like the notion of defining what the end looks like before you get there. Achievable, realistic, I mean, I think those are pretty clear too. And then I think also under step 2, that theory of change is really important and something that we don't often talk about. Making sure that you know how what you're doing is going to help you to reach your objective is a very important part of that. So what are the assumptions you make about how your proposed activities or approaches will help you to reach those end goals? And again, these are things that sometimes happen at the beginning of the proposal writing process. But they're also things that can happen later on. And as projects evolve, sometimes it's really nice to be able to go back and revisit some of those things. Scott, you want to jump in?
Sure. Just as Corey was saying, a lot of these activities are done in the pre-proposal stage that filter on through into the post-award phase, which makes my life easier because I'm pretty much all in the post-award phase. I like to do the execution of the project. I like to make sure that everything is up and running as smoothly as possible. But yes, just as Corey is saying, the more you can plan now, the better on the execution phase it will happen as you go into the post award contractual phase of the project.
Should we move on to budgeting?
Sure.
Great. So the budgeting, I think, is it's funny. Budgeting is, again, one of those huge topics, and every project looks a little bit different. And donors typically also want to see different things. But there's some pretty common cost items that are part of every budget. And even if you are not the finance expert on your team, and you should have a finance expert on your team, you're going to need to know all these different things and how the different pieces fit together. Salary, staff fringe benefits, consultants, travel and transport. And again, I'm not going to read through all of these things because it's better just to have some time to talk and to answer some questions at the end. But maybe the next slide also. There we go. Training, seminars, workshops, the events, even the kickoff meeting, equipment and supplies, other direct costs is a category that might be a little bit unfamiliar to many. But those are things like communications, office supplies, equipment, office rental, things that tend to be, they may be part of, some of them may be considered an indirect cost, depending on how you do your budgeting. But in many cases, there are things where you want to keep track of these costs separately. And then finally, indirect costs, which are general operational costs. They're things that you're not writing out item by item. They may be part of overhead or general and administrative costs. And again, this is depending on the donor, they can look very different. USAID has a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement. I think that I've said that right, the NICRA. And if you're working with USAID a lot, then your organization probably has its own NICRA. And that NICRA is the percentage of allowed official indirect cost that USAID calculates is how much it costs for you to run your operations, basically. Scott, do you think I got that right?
Absolutely. And then many of the organizations that we deal with don't have negotiated indirect cost rates. So with the federal government, we are given what they call a minimus rate. So it's a 10% max rate that all of our subawards are allowed to use, because many of them don't have negotiated indirect cost rates. Many of our partners in Africa and Asia don't. And then let me just touch backwards a little bit in what our institutions deem risk rates. So we have a lot of institutions that haven't been established for many years. They don't have financial audits. So what our university does is consider them a high risk organization. Now, in the grand scheme of things, it really means nothing other than to provide documentation for all of these budgeted items. So for your trainings, your seminars, your equipment, you're going to have to provide documentation and receipts as you spend for those activities. These are something that on down the line into the reimbursement parts of it that are very critical when determining your institution. So refer back to your contract if there's documentation that's going to be required for each and every one of these line items. Be upfront in how you're going to collect that. Work with your institution on what that looks like and what that's acceptable to their prime. And, as you'll see on down the line in the next couple slides, communication is key.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think one of the biggest lessons that I learned once I became country director at ITE was being able to budget appropriately for all of that administrative cost. And so, for instance, if I know that a donor is going to require a large amount of paperwork and receipts for every single item, and some donors are worse than others about this and requiring more admin, as we would call it. But some donors, well, basically, I have to make sure that I have the team in place to be able to actually administer all of that paperwork, and it can be a really large expense for us in some ways. So making sure that we're building in that margin to cover those that extra paperwork burden is kind of an important thing. Next slide. Scott, why don't you take this away?
Sure. Contracting with our prime sponsor is in international work and international development is USAID. As you'll see, when you put together your budgets, you're going to be putting together a budget, your statement of work, your period of performance, and then there's risk assessment steps and processes that each institution is going to need in order to establish a subaward with your organization. Now, I don't need to review all the list of requirements, but it's key at this point to be clear and concise of your budget categories. As realistic as possible, or your best estimate. And then your kickoff, your period of performance. Are you doing a survey that is weather dependent? Can we have everything established prior to kickoff? Because we've worked in areas in ag that it's the rainy season. Well, the rainy season is their evaluation of all of the activities they have collected in data. So some of these locations that we deal with are really dependent on weather, timing, and we all want to make sure that all of these issues that could crop up have been placed on your primary donor in advance, so that we can all react to it timely. Which I don't know about your institution, but ours is pretty big and it's pretty slow. So more time that we have to react to these issues and concerns, the quicker we can get things moving. We can go to the next slide, I think, unless Corey, did you have anything?
Nope.
Okay. Oh, looks like we lost a slide. There we go. So our subawards are contracts between our prime recipients and our implementing partners. So at Michigan State University, we receive the prime agreement and do pass on contracts to our subawardees. These subawardees often have special provisions for consideration that should be thought about prior to putting together your contract. Those include advance funds for cash flow, reporting requirements, financial management of the award, audit requirements in your budgets, any intellectual property and its use. So all of these issues and concerns should be well thought about prior to opening up the contractual agreement between the prime and the subawardee. These are just a highlight of some of the key areas that you want to have agreement on, because once we get to the contractual phase, you really want to have all of these situations dealt with, and we want to get the contracts and get rolling. Corey, do you have things that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think I'd just say this is not the exciting part of the project, or the project development, or the launch of a project. It can be really tough to go through contracts in great detail. But if you're running a subaward, if you're applying for and running your own project, you have to at least be paying attention to a few really important things. And I think, um, how is the money getting to you to actually implement the project? And when is it getting to you? Is it getting to you as reimbursement of expenses, or is it coming to you in advance? Is it going directly to your bank account, or do you have to put in a request for that? All of those kinds of things are going to be in the contract. Reporting, absolutely. When are you reporting? What do you need to report? You need to get into some real detail in that contract. Your contract is going to be the document of record. If something is in the contract, then you're going to be responsible for it. And if it's not in the contract, then that's something that you shouldn't have to be responsible for, and that's something that you can discuss with the prime or with the donor if you run into some conflict there. But that contract is the document of record, so it really is the most important thing. At least within IDE, we have a few things also that we like to pay attention to. Intellectual property rights is one that is, since we do a lot of technology, we work a lot with technology, and we have do a lot of human-centered design around that. We want to make sure that anything that comes out of our work, it's very, very clear that that product is going to be available to the public. We need to be able to disseminate anything that is produced as a part of one of our projects. So that's something that we pay a lot of attention to. Making sure that that if there's a termination clause, that it's not one-sided. Sometimes a contract says we can close the contract immediately, and says nothing about what the subawardee can do, for example. So we would want to make sure that there's a fair balance between, if we feel like we're not getting our fair share from the project in some way, that we have the right to terminate as well. I think every organization is going to have its own priorities on that front. But those are a couple of things that we like to pay attention to.
Yes, definitely read your contracts, absorb them, and then ask questions about them. There's no harm in questioning any stipulation in a contract. At least for MSU, we include our prime contract, which includes any restrictions or requirements for us that flow down to the subawardees. So feel free to read your contracts in nauseam and ask questions, because that will, like Corey said, that will be the record of agreement between both institutions.
Yeah, and sometimes it may feel like you really need to have a lawyer in the room to be reading through the contract, and you might. It's very possible. I think most of the time, though, even if it's very complicated language and can be a little bit frustrating to go through, I think most of the time it should be clear. And if it's not clear, like Scott says, definitely ask questions. I think sometimes it feels like you're given a contract and you're expected just to sign it and send it back. Never do that. Always go through the extra trouble to make sure you know exactly what is in there.
Absolutely agree.
Callisto, what's next?
So I put on here keys to success. Keys to, all right, we have both agreed on the contract, we have signed agreements, everything is all set. What's the key to success? My biggest key to success is communication between each institution. If there's a question, ask. Please, 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 please never struggle amongst yourself if there's something that the other institution can easily remedy, or if you run into an issue or concern. It's always best to include your prime, include the contractor in helping to resolve any problem, issues, concerns. I find that the most communication or the most communicative subawardees are the easiest to deal with because we develop a rapport with one another. We understand each other, and it gives us the opportunity to explain our perspective or our expectation. The second biggest key, because I'm in the finance end, is invoicing. Constant and consistent invoicing. Monthly if you can, bi-monthly if you have to, quarterly if it's an absolute, if you absolutely can't accomplish the first two. That keeps your cash flow flowing. At MSU, we often do advance funds for our subawardees that do not have sufficient funding to kick off your projects. So it's key to have that money, spend it down, and then invoice and replenish that fund. So at MSU, that is a big thing for us, is consistent, constant invoicing. And then the third key to success is documentation. Documentation, even if you're not required in a contract, it's always best to maintain and document all of your activities. Many of our contracts come with a 3-year retention due to an audit. So, documentation is key for the finance group. If there's ever any question, you have proof and documentation as to how and what and why these things happen. Corey, would you like to add your keys to success?
Keys to success. No, I think that this is great. What I'm reflecting on myself is I'm taking it back to the work planning and the budgeting, and thinking how actually very important it is to have all of these pieces tied together. We skipped a little bit quickly past the work planning just to be, to move ahead with the conversation. But already when you're developing that work plan, you're starting to plan out what your expenses are going to look like over the course of the project. When you figure out your activities based on what your end goals are, and you start to develop that timing, and you figure out that process, and it may begin before the proposal is sent in, and then that may continue and may be refined continuously during the initial stages of the project and even later. As you're thinking through that schedule, that's going to feed directly into, obviously, the budgeting aspects of it, and then also to this contracting side. So as Scott says, it's important to keep the money flowing. And so understanding how much money you're going to need at what time can be a big challenge. And depending on the contract, there are options if you don't quite know what your cash flow is going to look like. For example, you might see a contract that says the next payment, you can invoice for the next payment once such and such a percentage of the previous quarter's expenses have been paid or incurred. So, depending on, you can get that payment based on whatever the last quarter might have looked like, for example. But that cash flow piece, I think you're right, Scott. I think that's exactly the most important thing from our side.
And projecting your expenses and activities, because everything that we have in research has peaks and valleys. It's those peaks that have the most expense that we want to make sure that we have cash flow on hand to accommodate, so that we can have those peak, get them reimbursed as quickly as possible, so that on the valley you're not running into payroll issues. My biggest thing is making sure that everybody gets paid, payroll hits, and your activities are observed. And put together a pipeline. Put together a pipeline of your activities. Plan at least 3 months ahead, if at all possible. That it's really important to plan ahead in this type of situation so that you don't run into cash flow issues.
Scott, I'm kind of curious, for thinking about the budgeting side of things, what financial types of management have you seen for smaller subawardees? We're a pretty big international NGO. We have a system that we use through all of our country programs. But for a smaller subawardee applying for this, how would they set up that budget?
So the three biggest things are payroll, it's going to be travel, and then the actual activity that they're going to conduct. So I have had organizations as simple as Excel spreadsheets and maintaining PDF files of the receipts for documentation. So we have, I think the smallest organization we have ever dealt with is a five-man operation that was very simple. It was, here's your contract, here's your execution. We almost always advance funds for small operations. And in our contracts, it says your repayment of that advance fund will be repaid over the last, let's say, 4 invoices. So it really working together with the finance office at MSU, we can budget it correctly and say, all right, here's the estimate of your time. Here's the activity. We've put together a budget for that. And then we work closely together in documentation and reimbursement of that contract, because most of our contracts are cost reimbursable. So yeah, simple way of saying Excel and PDF backup documentation.
That's great. So it doesn't even have to be that complicated. That's actually
Nope.
really nice to see. Any questions?
Thank you, guys. I know that can be a tough topic, and I really appreciate you did a great job, trying to condense it down into a digestible format, and we gave you a really hard job with that huge topic area. So I appreciate that. We have one question in the Q&A right now, and I encourage everyone to post their questions either in the Q&A or in the chat. It says, it's from Titus. Is this contracting method general? I mean, organizations can use it apart from USAID.
So with us, yes, we have almost a universal contracting, a universal contract in which we both utilize for federal funds and non-federal funds. Depending on our prime and how we contract with our subawardees, depends on the nature of the contract. So for example, if we are bound to a cost reimbursable contract, then that will flow down to our subawardee. If we can put together a fixed price contract for the subawardee and it's allowable within our prime, we can also utilize that method. But our contract at MSU is pretty standard itself. It's the first 5 pages of it is all of the legal jargon at the university. I'd like to say I could memorize it, but I don't read it as nearly as closely as the subawardees do.
Yeah, I have to read those very carefully. I think, yeah, the contracting can look, at least for us from our side, and we tend to be prime on most awards, though we do sub awards. For example, for the innovation lab, we regularly are a sub awardee, but as the person on our side reading that contract, there are two different types of contracts usually. And one might be, one is a contract and one would be a consulting agreement. And so I would say, at least from our side, that's what those are the two main categories. Contracts, again, they can look like a lot of different things, but I think we actually gave you the sort of standard categories for a contract, and you're going to see those in everything, no matter who the donor is, no matter who the prime recipient is, you're going to see those same categories. If you are given a consulting agreement rather than a contract, that's probably going to look very different. At least from our side, for instance, if we have a sub-awardee that we offer a consulting agreement to, it's going to be a lot more flexible, and it'll be based on specific deliverables. And it would give you the opportunity to develop your own timeline, to to figure out how you're going to accomplish the goals. It's less restrictive, and it tends to be something where, trying to think of a good example. We might say, for example, we have a consulting agreement on a current project where over a 5-year period, we have a number of things that we're trying to accomplish to benefit the larger project, and we have a very specific set of objectives with it, and those objectives then are contractually the only thing in a way that we're responsible for, and we get paid based on those deliverables. I don't know, I don't mean to confuse things too much, but just to say that there are really, at least for us as a sub-awardee, there are two types of contracts, and sometimes they're going to look a lot simpler, and that's actually a very good thing for us as a sub-awardee, to have that flexibility to be able to do the work kind of on our own schedule, if that makes sense.
Yeah, at MSU, we do have the same. We have consultant agreements that we can consult with individuals, and on occasions we have consultant agreements with institutions as well. But the distinguishing factor for MSU is that a consultant is just that. It's a consultant. It's not a contribution to the project whole. And when you're talking a large institution, large involvement, implementing partners, those are all contractual agreements.
Okay, thank you. We've had a couple more questions come in. First one is, any comment on unsuccessful or failed projects due to funder or implementer? And how are such cases managed in most cases? So I don't know if this is a question for just you guys or for you guys and the previous group, but since you're on the screen right now, I guess we'll pose it to you.
Well, I'd like to say everything was always perfect with us, but yes, we have had organizations fail to deliver. And in our particular case, we've had to recollect advance funds. Everything that we have done in recollection of those funds has been done amicably. They meaning the implementing partner understood that they were unable to accomplish the task or the expectation, and had returned the funds back to MSU. It's very key for your PIs to have relations with these implementing partners, the consultants, the people on the ground doing the activities. And yes, we have had them, and they have been I don't know, it's, for lack of a better term, it was amicable. Nothing that we have had has been really cutthroat or, I don't know, breaking. I don't know, Corey, what's your experience?
It's a tough question, and I would say most important thing is what Scott was saying earlier, communication. Communication is the most important aspect. If something looks like it's going to fail, be in touch with your donor or prime early on, make it very clear what's going on. We've actually found that USAID is very willing to be flexible in a lot of cases. And we work a lot with a local mission in Nepal, and we have a good relationship with them. We can speak to them directly and say, look, this was part of the project. It doesn't actually look like it's going to be the right thing to do at this time. It's not going to work for the following reasons, or or the situation has changed. And they're very open to those discussions. They sometimes will still come back and say, well, you still have to do it. In which case, you're stuck. But for the most part, I don't think that we've had trouble with that. I think, as Scott has said, that reclaiming of funds is a challenge, and this isn't something that's happened to us specifically, but we got some blowback from another situation with a donor who had previously given an award to a local organization, and they had contracted badly. And it's a good illustration of why the contract is so important. They'd contracted badly with this organization, and the organization did the bare minimum, didn't achieve any of the objectives, basically took the money that they were given to do more with and ran with it, and refused to give any of the money back. The donor was burned, and it wasn't USAID. It was a smaller foundation. They were quite upset with it. And then we, as another awardee from the same donor, then had to deal with the donor's overreaction to that, so that from now on, every single contract with that donor is going to be a lot harder. Every single process with that donor is going to be a lot harder, because of that one badly written contract. So it's a really important thing to keep that focus on making sure that the contract does spell things out. And again, as Scott was saying earlier, ask questions when you get that contract to make sure that you really understand what the right assumptions are.
Thank you very much. We are at time. We're supposed to have a 10-minute break, but we do have 2 more questions and a hand raised. So I'm wondering if you all would be willing to answer those 2 questions before we take our break.
Sure.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So the next question is, are we expected to regularly review the risks of the contract with stakeholders?
So at MSU, the risk assessment is done on an annual basis, or if a contract has a shortened term, let's say if the contract is a 9-month term, they'll often review the risk assessment with the subawardee at that point in time. But no, ours is done on an annual or semi-annual basis.
From our side, we look at risks on a really, it's part of our quarterly review process. It's not, when you say reviewing the risks with stakeholders, that can mean a lot of different kinds of stakeholders. I think, from our standpoint, it's just a standard part of that review process. We want to know what risks we're going to incur in the next quarter compared with the previous quarter, for example. Anything new? Has anything new come up? What about monsoon season? What about COVID? There's a lot that we have to think about in terms of reviewing the risks. We tend to think about it as risks to ourselves, though, and risks to the project. I think our framing of it is a little bit different, but it's still generally a part of that ongoing repeated process. It's not in a formal way in the sort of contractual side of it. It's really on the implementation side. Yeah,
whereas ours is I'm referring to the financial, exclusively the financial side.
Perfect. Thank you. So our last question before we go to the hand that's raised: does timely implementation also qualify as one of the keys to successful contracting?
So that goes back to communication. Timely implementation is communicated between the implementer and the prime PI. So if there is an issue with timely implementation on the ground, that should be communicated with the principal investigator, so that both institutions can react and, you know, and understand where they're going to end up.
Agreed. I would flip it also and say that it needs to be built into the contract. A good contract will include clauses that will make timely implementation necessary. In other words, if you're not implementing in a timely way, you're not getting paid for the work that you should be doing. Timely implementation is always critical. It's always important. Sometimes it has to be, sometimes there are delays outside of our, outside of our ability to, outside of our control. But I think, to the extent possible, we're all trying to implement in a timely way. And if we're not able to, then yeah, we don't get paid. So that's a really, it's a really important part that needs to be built into the process early on.
So thank you very much, Scott and Corey. We really appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.